Herr Kreisky.
Good afternoon, here at Kreisky's Wohnzimmer, the salon of Bruno Kreisky, Austria's former Chancellor. It is with great pleasure that I can welcome Soli Özel, Professor Özel from Istanbul, a long-standing guest of the Kreisky Forum, a very well-known and renowned professor of international relations and political scientist. Professor Özel wrote a lot about Turkish politics, Turkish strategy, but also general about strategic events, strategic developments, and this is why he's here now. We will talk about Turkey too.
Very happy to be here.
We will talk about Turkey too, but the core is a remark you made a few days ago, according to which you say that the year 22 will be a key country, a key event, where key events take place, or results of events that took already place have to be put in a broader strategic context. That's a very important point. And at the time of we are speaking, we're one day ahead of a great NATO summit, NATO-Russia summit, I have to add, which is one of those events you identified, which will kind of put all countries, forces them to position themselves. Maybe let's start with a look back to one event which came to many as a surprise, and that was this, whether we call it a strategic surprise or not, or a domestic affair, remains to the eye of the beholder, and that is Kazakhstan. And as a professor from Turkey, you're in a way condemned to have a say.
and learn more about Kazakhstan than I ever cared to.
No,
yes.
but you know, this issue of expectations, because in the end it is important, and it gained importance.
Yeah.
And in contrary to 20 years ago, where we had a Central Asia expert on every corner, this came really as a surprise.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Walter, and thank you to the Kreisky Forum for having me here. My general approach to this year is that after a lot of turbulence, 2022 may be the year when chips are finally falling into place. There may yet be changes, drastic changes, as a result of presidential elections in the United States, because we know the trajectory of American policy, or we see it since Obama distancing from Europe, putting more resources to Asia and the so-called Indo-Pacific region. But then you had a Trump, which basically wanted to continue that policy, but in a far more radical fashion. You had an American president who apparently 3 times spoke about withdrawing from NATO, which I suppose would be the end of NATO. Now we have someone who's been actually groomed, if you will, in the Cold War, President Biden. He does attach a lot of importance to transatlantic relations, but he is also along the road in favor of Europe doing more for itself and taking certain positions, and then obviously putting China at the center of things. So in that sense, I was waiting in 2022 to see the final shape of the strategic compass of the European Union, which will be made public, I think, in March,
yes.
and the NATO summit of June in Madrid, and in between there will also be important elections. We already had one very important election, that was the German election. We have a new government and actually a new approach to world affairs, I think, in Germany. We will have the French elections, and equally as important in my view, we will have the Hungarian elections. It's important for Europe, and we will have the Brazilian elections, and of course American midterm elections. So in that sense, we will have a clearer view, I think, at the beginning of 2023 than we do today. Now, I did not anticipate Kazakhstan. One, I know nothing about Kazakhstan. And it came as a surprise even to those who actually were supposed to know something about Kazakhstan. Based on what I've read so far, it strikes me as a very expected development given the kind of regime that Kazakhstan had. In fact, one of my general approaches or one of my general assessments about the world is repression does and will continue to increase, but so will resistance in all sorts of ways, gender ways or peasants in India, whatever. Yeah. So finally in Kazakhstan, something must have broken the camel's back. There must have been the last straw. The people have, I mean, and that was of course the price rise in energy prices. And after they were withdrawn, obviously some other forces also came into play. There was a lot of violence, and ultimately the Kazakh government would have to rely on a security organization of like-minded states, and Russian troops and others are now in Kazakhstan to provide security. In the meantime, I think that insurrection, the anarchical conditions, the violence, and the demand for peace and stability, and the invitation of the troops also resolved what I suppose was a major problem for the current Kazakh president, Tokayev. He got rid of his predecessor and the influence that his predecessor obviously had. I understand Mr. Nazarbayev has left the country and many people who were close to him in the government were also sacked. So now Mr. Tokayev is in charge of his country. Whether or not he will rely more on the Russians remains to be seen, and what kind of impact that might have on Russia-China relations, because the Chinese first reactions were also a bit like guarded or reserved. As for Turkey, Turkey will work whichever government operates in Kazakhstan. Turkey has operated with all the governments in the Istans. Sometimes it did have problems, for instance, with Turkmenistan at some point. But at the end of the day, Turkey has a lot of economic interest in those countries. It sees those countries as part of its markets and infrastructure investment, and it's opening to the rest of Asia. In fact, one way I think one can interpret the Turkish involvement in the Azerbaijan-Armenia war over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 was Turkey wanted to, at the end, Turkey wanted to get access to the Caspian Sea and beyond the Caspian Sea. And in that, I think they even will come to an entente with Russia. And you know, Turkey and Armenia have both appointed representatives to start talking. Effectively, the reason why Turkey does not have diplomatic relations with Armenia is now off the table, because it was, the reason was why the border was closed and they did not have ambassadors was because Azerbaijan proper was occupied. Now that occupation is over and the relations may actually get normalized. So I think Turkey will adjust and adopt to whatever new reality there is. I don't think it really has a dog in that fight. There are accusations that Turkey may have sent, and there are accusations all the time, it may have sent jihadists. I don't know if that is actually correct. But because Turkey really had good relations with Kazakhstan, I don't see why it would be engaged in a subversive activity against the existing Kazakh government. So I'll leave it at that.
It wouldn't be in Turkish tradition.
No, it wouldn't be.
One wonders whether this Kazakhstan crisis can be now dealt with as an episode, a domestic one, but dealt with on the bilateral basis with Russia. But it seems, contrary to the very first assessments, not to have a great impact on, say, Russia's policy or capabilities towards Ukraine or anything else. It seems to be much more a police operation, and the EU was slow to react. The USCE reacted the way they have to, because all members there. But basically, it seems to be over. Can we?
That's what, again,
from an international perspective, not for a domestic one. There, things might be different.
I think so, because I understand the Russian government also declared that within 10 days their troops are going to leave. So I suppose stability is back, and the big issue we need to discuss is really Ukraine. I mean, that is a crisis that has been brewing. You mentioned that we are speaking on the eve of an important NATO-Russia summit, but of course we're also speaking in the wake of a bilateral Russian-American talks on the 10th of I think they took place in Vienna or Brussels? Geneva, I'm sorry.
Geneva.
In Geneva. Okay, and it turns out that the two sides were not any closer, although the Russians have said very openly that they did not have a decision to invade Ukraine. They did not say they did not have an intention. That's my understanding of the translations. Now, Turkey is in a very funny position when it comes to that crisis. On the one hand, because the government in Turkey feels betrayed by its Western partners, and I must say, I find personally the attitude, the non-active or the passive observant behavior of Turkey's allies when there was a coup attempt on the 15th of July 2016, utterly shameful. And I can understand why the Turkish government, which already had its doubts about Western solidarity on many issues, most notably on the help the United States gives to PYD, YPG, and it's an issue that you know very well. It turned to Russia, which immediately showed solidarity. In fact, there are even rumors and Russian claims that they have warned the Turkish government that the coup was actually coming. Anyway, that led then to an amelioration of relations with Russia, whose plane the Turkish Air Force has shut down only a few months before the coup attempt. The Russians then gave Turkey the green light to actually enter Syria in August of 2016, and then they have given Turkey a green light to do 3 more military interventions. And as a result, they also got Turkey to buy S-400 defensive missiles from Russia, to the horror of Turkey's NATO partners and ultimately to the horror of the US Congress,
but we have to put a caveat here. These missiles are not deployed. We doubt that they will ever be deployed.
Turkey never said that they would never be deployed, but they are not deployed. I mean, don't get me.
What I want to say is, it's not about the missiles as a military means, but as a diplomatic, political tool. I think that's much more powerful, because you cannot run a NATO hardware air force with the Russian air defense
Walter,
system.
with all due respect, the cost of buying the S-400s has been enormous for the country. First of all, we got kicked out of the F-35 program. We cannot even get the F-35s we paid for, or Turkey paid for. And recently, Turkey was supposed to sell helicopters, $1.5 billion worth of helicopters to Pakistan. That order got canceled because the engine used was supposed to come from the United. I mean, so the cost the cost of getting the S-400s, whether Turkey deploys them or not, had been exorbitant. Okay, and so you really have to come back and say, was it really worth it? I, among many others in Turkey who actually know these matters, and I'm not very good at military matters, but I know good people who write about these things. We can't use them. They're not going to be useful for us, and the cost or the price we had to pay for getting them was far too high and certainly not worth it. At any rate, and the purchase of the S-400s got Turkey and Russia very close to one another. It's not an equal relationship. I mean, in February of 2020, the Russians have actually murdered 36 Turkish soldiers and the Turkish government didn't really say much about that either.
In Syria, you mean?
In Syria, of
yes.
course, yes. Although they were, I mean, it's the words of the Turkish permanent representative in the UN that I'm using.
Yeah.
He said, we did tell the Russians to stop, and they just didn't, and 36 Turkish soldiers were dead. On the other hand, the same Turkey sells drones to Ukraine, is very active in the Black Sea with NATO, exercises that are obviously meant to give messages to Russia. And in a way, for the last 4 or 5 years, Turkey tried to actually play both sides. NATO, the United States, and Russia. Whether or not that can continue was a big question to begin with. And if indeed 2022 is a year when chips are really going to fall into place, it seems to me Turkey, just like Europe, will be forced to make a very important decision about its own strategic identity. Our defense minister, and this is the final word, our defense minister consistently and repetitively says, Turkey is NATO, NATO is Turkey. And okay, the military no longer calls the shots on security and foreign policy, perhaps, but this is as firm a position as anybody has taken. Erdogan never really denounced NATO, although he's complained about it, and certainly complained about the allies. Bilaterally, he had a lot of fights with many of the allies. But this ambiguity or this ambivalence that Turkey benefited from, or at least this government thought Turkey benefited from, I don't think can continue. And probably this year or at the latest next year, Turkey's strategic identity will have to be much more clearly enunciated.
But there have always been kind of tensions between certain member states and Turkey within NATO. I mean, the classic was the 1970s with Greece, and even that did not weaken the alliance in the broader strategic outlook, because the broader strategic outlook was clear.
Cold War.
It was straightforward. You knew what NATO was about. You knew the area it's supposed to operate. You knew the, let's be blunt, the enemy and so on. And how far did the post-Cold War situation, where this is not that clear any longer? Some were talking about broader NATO, then there was, for a while even, there was a not so serious, but there was a debate in Washington to get NATO into the Middle East. Well, you don't have NATO in the Middle East, but you have certain NATO missions, you have NATO countries there, which totally changes when you define certain countries which are in Turkey's neighborhood. This changes the Turkish calculus and so on. But even so, is it more about Turkey behaving as some diplomat, or some pundits rather, in the West said, behaved erratic due to its president, or is it rather because NATO is a little bit out of focus in many regards?
You said it, I didn't, yes. Look, let's be, I mean, it's not the focus of our discussion, but there are lots of things one should revisit on the West's security policies of the past 30 years. Was it really worth annoying the Russians so much by expanding NATO in the way it was done? Would it have been more intelligent to keep the Partnership for Peace as a viable program than anything else? Was it, could the West have responded to signals and messages, hardlines messages coming from Russia at the time, so that we would not find ourselves now with the prospect of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, against which there is no military option, and the Americans have said as much. And quite frankly, economic sanctions, Venezuela is under economic sanctions, and the guy is still there and will continue to be there. So there are lots of things that need to be revisited, and one of the things, of course, was the reason why in the post-Cold War period contrary to what a lot of people at the beginning thought, Turkey's importance has actually increased.
Yes.
Because the strategic space has expanded with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And also, Turkey's own security interests were no longer necessarily totally in line with the security interests of the United States. Turkey did not want the Iraq War.
Yeah.
It had very good reasons not to want the Iraq War, and the Americans were not going to listen to anyone. So parts of the arguments is like, we do whatever we want and you have to really go along with it. That is not the world we're living in. Particularly after the Americans have failed so miserably in Iraq and Afghanistan, naturally. I mean, isn't it a bit shameful that you actually give back power to those people that you deposed 20 years earlier? That's basically the net result of the Afghan war. Anyway, Turkey now has probably militarily, except for the YPG support, close relations with the United States. But the real problems now again are with Greece and now, of course, the Republic of Cyprus, what we call the Greek Cypriots, and of course France. Mm-hmm. Maybe the audience is not well aware, but France and Greece have just signed a mutual defense agreement in September of 2021, whose second article goes way beyond the fifth article of NATO and says that the parties promise to help one another if they are under attack by a third party. By the third party, you can read Turkey. I think it's so irresponsible. It is so irresponsible. And then just recently, the Americans decided not to support energy explorations in Eastern Mediterranean, and suddenly the Greek government is up in arms because they were not expecting that. In a way, everybody, but partially the reason why all those things have come to that head is that Turkey's foreign policy has been too militarized after 2016. And now I think the Turkish government, after having paid a high price for this militarization, which then totally isolated Turkey in all its neighborhood, and created blocs that are against it. The Mediterranean Forum on the one hand is now trying to make amends with almost every country that it has either insulted or offended or alienated. Whether or not this will bear fruit, we'll see. Already, unexpectedly, the United Arab Emirates, that was seen as the financier of the coup attempt, is now a brotherly country. The Turkish president will visit Saudi Arabia, whose crown prince has ordered the brutal murder of a dissident journalist in the consulate of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul. Amends are trying to be made with Egypt and even with Israel. The President Erdogan has just said that the Turkish-Israeli relation was essential for Middle Eastern security. I actually knew that, but that for him to actually reiterate that, in spite of the fact that there are differences of opinion between Turkey and Israel, especially when it comes to the Palestinians, was important. So we'll see how this charm attack is going to result. And honestly, I know especially the French are very angry with the Turks that Turkey has saved the legitimate government in Tripoli from Haftar's forces. It changed the situation on the ground. Whether or not Libya is a manageable crisis, I really do not know. And it also ended the gridlock of the Minsk process in Armenia, Azerbaijan. Of course, war is brutal. War is not something personally, in terms of my personal choices, something that I like seeing happening. But it did break some obstacles, it did break some gridlocks, and we're now on a different pattern. And as I said, Turkey is now trying to make amends and reduce the scope of its ambitions, but it certainly wants to be a regional power, and I think it does present itself to the NATO alliance as one of the buffers against Iranian expansionism, and that, of course, is something that you know much, much better than I do.
We come to the issue of Turkey being one of the few countries with the real army, with real capacity of power projection, regardless how the economic, in what shape the economy is. That is, I think, the very important point around.
The economy is not in good shape.
Yeah, it's not in good shape. We know, but whose is when we're going to pay for the corona crisis? We will see later. So, but there's 3 points I would like to address from what you mentioned before. The one was on the French-Greek defense agreement. When we look into the thorny relationships of these twin nations, Greece and Turkey, because you find so many similarities on either side, and you can perfectly understand either position depending on your geographies. You sit on a Greek island, you understand the Greek position.
Absolutely.
You sit, serve in the Turkish Navy in Izmir, and you try to leave the curves, the isthmus of Izmir, and you understand the Turkish position perfectly. These positions are irreconcilable, but very well managed. They were always prey to domestic politics. They were played up, they were played down. But in spite of all these highly emotionalized tensions on either side, in spite of provocations of domestic infighting, whatever it be, they were always well managed. There was never a breakdown of contacts.
We did come close to war in 1996, though.
In 1990s, and there I know this was this Kardak Island incident and so on, but even so, it was also in a way a wake-up call again for coming to NATO and all the international diplomacy.
Cooler heads prevailed, yes.
It was quite, cooler heads prevailed always, and it seemed to me kind of a very stable crisis. Yes, the emotions are there. And on the popular level, after the propaganda is done, people get well along on either side. This was perhaps one of the most surprising things. But did this defense agreement, has this defense agreement the capacity that it changes the calculus of the cooler heads in Ankara?
That is, I'm glad you raised this because I left it out, but that is really what scares me. Because, I mean, I am on record, I have always been in favor of a solution in Cyprus and much better relations between Turkey and Greece, because I think the antagonism is basically illogical and all that. And quite frankly, after 1999 in particular, things were really moving in the right direction as well, although none of the core issues were resolved. And I'll relate this ultimately to the EU and the kind of how shall I say, sophomoric calculations of EU members when they made the decision to actually accept Cyprus as a member without the resolution of the matter. Now, you know, historically, if a third party feels that two parties are ganging up on it with no real reason, quite frankly, they get defensive, and that may then prompt them, or that may induce them to want to act preemptively. And that's what this security or defense agreement, I'm afraid, has the potential of doing. Turkish reaction to it was not very emotional at all. Yeah, my understanding is when they met, after they have traded insults, when they met in Rome at the G20 summit, the Turkish and the French presidents actually talked about this, and the French gave assurances to the Turks that that second article, that they did not interpret the second article as the Greeks did, but that we don't know the full story of why that article was worded the way it was and was inserted in the agreement. And just 2 or 3 days ago, Turkish defense minister has actually warned Greece and said, look, we're trying to settle matters. We have these exploratory talks. And why are you not responding to our openings? And as you said, the Greek perception of what Turkey does, of course, is very different. I mean, when Turkey tries to send migrants Greece's way, obviously the Greeks get very worried and react to this as well. But so long as the roads of dialogue are open, I would not be terribly concerned. Unfortunately, and that's what I find so objectionable in the French position, the Americans were the ones who actually calmed the waters at the last moment. And the Americans are not taking a much more, if not passive, observing position, and they're not interfering. And for the French, an important member of NATO, to actually take a position on the side of one of the members that has a conflict with the other, I think is just diplomatically wrong. However, emotionally, the French have always been with the Greeks. That's not a big problem. But to actually make a commitment like that is, in my judgment, not very conducive to maintaining that stable equilibrium of contestation that you've just described.
But certainly, Turkey's presence in Libya played an important role, and especially the border agreement, the sea border agreement, which really infuriated naval circles all over the world. For better or worse, because I'm not an expert on this topic.
But that naval map has been objected to, or has been thought of as both irrational and irresponsible within Turkey as well. And that the problem there was the way the Greeks and its partners wanted to delineate continental shelves and stuff and economic zones was also irrational because of a small island, Maze in Turkish, I can't remember its name in Greeks.
The Castellorozzo.
Castellorozzo.
Yeah, that's, I feel like they didn't name
yeah, I
it,
mean, okay. But the thing is, because Turkey has so alienated itself, because it so offended so many different partners, even its legitimate concerns did not get a hearing.
Yeah.
You see? And so it is Turkey's fault that its legitimate concerns did not get a hearing. I'll grant you that. And I think that way. On the other hand, that Turkey had legitimate concerns was not heard by others who were involved in that. With the French,
who should, because they are allies of Turkey.
With the French, of course, it was Libya. In Armenia, by the way, it was because allegedly the Turks have sent Syrian jihadis to fight as well. I don't know why they've done that the French have turned against Turkey. And in Western Africa as well, Turkey and France don't see eye to eye. And I think the French are also turned off by the fact that the Turkish Directorate of Religious Affairs is far too active in France.
That's a total different topic where I could say a lot about, not only in France.
Yeah, I know, in Germany and in Austria. No, but the thing is...
but there's another issue.
That exacerbated
I would like
to
elaborate a little bit on this, on the very absurd situation with Haftar in Libya. Because Turkey was actually not only supporting the Western recognized government, which was not a strong government, we know. But also it was the very government which, I mean, Italy was on its side, and France on the other side, and Russia. And that tells quite, I mean, why studying strategy at all and the history of alliances when you end up with a situation like the EU in Libya, where everyone is on another side? And where the non-EU member but NATO member, Turkey, intervenes on one side and wins formally the legitimate. I mean, the situation is, for me, and please correct me, quite, if the EU cannot manage key countries in such an important theater like Libya to work at least on a common framework, we're EU-wide in trouble.
For which two of its members, or one is no longer a member, held a lot of responsibility because they destroyed whatever stability the Gaddafi governments actually provided, and then did the deed, and then did not provide the framework to reconstruct the country. Maybe it was unreconstructible. That's a different matter. Again, those are all things that Turkey, and not just France, but the European Union in general, will really have to sit down and with tensions down, really start talking about. Unfortunately, neither the Turkish side, unfortunately, the Turkish side does not trust its interlocutors in the EU, and the many important members of the EU do not trust the Turkish government. Maybe as things begin to look clearer, we will be able to find platforms when rationality will prevail. And I want to say a few things before our time is up about Turkey and the European Union. Realistically, membership is not really on the agenda, certainly not for the relevant future, maybe. On the other hand, European security, which is not solely consisting of military threats, migration, the refugee issue, the instability down south, in the Middle East, across the Mediterranean. On all of those things, Turkey and the European Union will really need to sit down and jointly create a framework within which to actually address these issues. The refugee issue is going to be with us definitely for the next 30, 40 years. And you cannot just pay Turkey to keep people there, because it's not just the Syrians who are coming, by the way. Afghans are coming, the Pakistan, whoever is unhappy is going to go either to Italy from the south or through Turkey. They'll try to make it to Turkey. Cannot afford to have them all, and the European Union will really have to sit down, and Turkey, both of them will have to be far more imaginative to see what they can do. Again, this goes also for the refugee waves that will be coming out of Africa because of climate change and assorted problems. Therefore, for the EU and Turkey not to have an ongoing civilized and constructive dialogue is actually detrimental to both. Secondly, if indeed the United States is going to be less invested in Europe, and if strategic autonomy does become a far more reachable or desired outcome of European deliberations on security, I really don't see how Turkey can actually be put outside of it. Honestly, I just don't. And Turkey can have good relations with Russia, but not necessarily be on Russia's side in security terms. But all of those things are now open to renegotiation, as is the entire transatlantic relationship is open to renegotiation. And for that, we need to have partners that trust one another, that trust one another's words. And for that, maybe we will have to wait for the next Turkish elections and also for the European Union to make up its mind as to what it is. For the European Union to treat what is presumably a candidate country as a threat like China and Russia is just, quite frankly, mind-boggling. It takes a conjecture as a structural problem, which I think is wrong. That conjectural problem may turn into a structural problem, and if it does so, that is, Turkey does indeed become a threat that is permanent as opposed to a partner, then both Turkey and the European Union will suffer the consequences, is my view.
Yeah. Soli, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure listening to you. We have to continue.
We will.
At some other point. And perhaps with a Middle Eastern or with more, again, a Russia focus. Or an update on...
waters will not calm down for some time. And maybe one last point, and that's for the European audiences as well. I think one belittles Egypt's problems.
Yes.
If Egypt explodes or implodes, Syria, Lebanon, all these will be child's play. You're talking about a country of 102 million people, population growing at a rate of 2 million a year, whose economy is basically in the sink. and whose government does not seem to have any concern for governing its population properly. And that is, in my view, a ticking bomb, which means the issues that led to the Arab revolt have not been solved. And sooner or later, they will come and visit us, and we will be coming back to the beginning of our conversation. Like in Kazakhstan, we will be surprised that somehow the population has just erupted.
And actually, we would like to have a strongman to be in charge, whom we know a little bit. In the end, it boils down to Ibn Taymiyyah again, have a tyrant but no anarchy.
But the thing is, the tyrants are no longer capable of providing order in the way in the 21st century we should understand order. We're no longer living in peasant societies.
That's the key point, key point that has been overlooked so often. Thank you very much for
having me. Thank you very much for having me.